Hello, everybody. This is the Monday Night Pod. Tyler Fensky. Tonight, we're going to be going over Psalm 51, starting in verse 1 here. It says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me." Just to add some context to this, the sin that David's referring to here is one of the more famous sins in the Bible. It's where he's committing adultery with Bathsheba. And the more context for that comes from 2 Samuel 11.
Yeah, as 2 Samuel 11 says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. That's the backdrop to the sin that he committed with Bathsheba, is that he got himself in trouble because he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing, which was conducting war. Mm-hmm. Right. So even in 1 Samuel 16, when you hear the resume of David, this is before he kills Goliath, and they're looking for someone who can play the harp to deal with this problem of Saul, right? Where Saul's dealing with this evil spirit, and they say, hey, if we get somebody to play the harp, you'll feel relief. So let's find somebody who can play the harp. And it describes David, and it says that, he knows how to play the harp. Also says he's a brave man and a warrior. So even before he kills Goliath, he's known as a warrior. And this was what really elevated him in his career, was that then he kills Goliath, right? He's got this song made about him. Saul's killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands, and he's having just massive success as a warrior. And that's what really then elevates him up the ranks, as it says in 1 Samuel. And eventually, Saul's jealousy of David because of his success against Goliath, his song, so on and so forth, causes Saul to then, try to kill David, drives him away. And then David, though, eventually becomes king over all Israel. And then that's where he then has more success in war, where victory over the long-standing enemies, the Philistines, defeats Moab, defeats Edom, defeats the Ammonites and the Arameans with them, where he's extending Israel's power all the way out to the Euphrates. And that's what he was known for, was being a warrior. And that 1 Samuel section makes that very clear, that he was, not what he was supposed to be doing. He was supposed to be, 2 Samuel 11, in the spring at the time when kings go off to war, but David remained in Jerusalem. So this would almost be like, Patrick Mahomes decides to just sit out the NFL season this past year, where somebody who's just tremendous at what they do, and, hey, I just don't feel like it this year, so I'm going to sit out the NFL season. Somebody's won 3 out of the last 4 Super Bowls. Same thing going on here with David, where his talents and his purpose, his identity was all bound up in being a warrior. That's what he was called to do. That's what even the Lord calls him in 1 Chronicles 28, in explaining why he could not build the temple. It had to be Solomon, because David was a warrior. So he's not where he's supposed to be, and that then is the backdrop for this sin that he commits with Bathsheba.
Yeah, the thing that stands out to me about David, and you touched on it from 1 Samuel, is you look at the rise of David. He was consistently in integrity with where the Lord had him. He was the shepherd boy who took pride in being a shepherd boy, right? He took pride in doing the best he could, despite of what his brothers thought about him, despite of what his own father thought about him. Mm-hmm. He was always in integrity with what the Lord thought about him, right? And so he was doing what he was supposed to be doing. He was handling whatever task was in front of him and maximizing the gifts that God gave him. And with that, the Lord was able to use that to propel him forward and grant him success after success and put him on the trajectory that he was on. And to see the contrast between where he's rising, and it seems like he could do no wrong, as far as outcomes go, and just granted success after success, victory after victory, you start to see the contrast, and he really lost that aspect of him, that aspect of integrity, of being where he was supposed to be. And the biggest takeaway for me from that is, where am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to be doing? Because the biggest trouble I've ever gone into in my life, the biggest trouble we could ever get in life, is being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if we're in integrity, if we're walking in our purpose and we're seeking our purpose, I think we'll avoid that more often than not.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. That is 100% a catalyst for people in life, not just of frustrations, but also getting into trouble is they're not walking out God's purpose in their life. Either they haven't identified their gifts and talents, or nobody has helped them identify that. And so they're not doing what they're called to do. And that can be just a time of frustration. And that's not, here's the one thing that I do for the next 60 years. That can change. Right? You take it from David's life and you see at the end of 2 Samuel where he goes out and he fights, and it says he became exhausted and almost is killed. And at that point, then his men come to him and say, no longer should you go out with us. Right? That was the time for him to then stop fighting and being that warrior at the very end of his career when he's old, right? This is not that time. It's not so much that he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's just he's not doing what he's being called to do. He's failing to walk in his calling right now by hanging out in Jerusalem instead of going out with the army and doing what he does best, which is be a warrior, right? And that's the other thing that people can get confused about with, purpose, like the example that, was used in the teaching tonight. So, Patrick Mahomes goes out there on a Sunday and plays, right? He gets hit 15 to 17 times by men that are very big and very fast, like getting hit by a truck. So he's dealing with all types of pains and soreness for days after, right? You listen to, NFL strength coach Buddy Morris talk about that. He's like, hey, guys don't get back online till really Wednesday after a game on Sunday, because it's that difficult of what's going on the NFL field on a Sunday, of just that car wreck of guys running into each other. So you got that going on. Then the rest of the week, he's practicing throughout the week. He's working out throughout the week. He's watching film. He's learning this next week's game plan to put in. So not just physical demands, but also mental. So there's a lot going into you seeing that level of success from him on Sunday. That's not just he walks out on the field and it just happens. There's a lot of preparation. There's a lot of work that goes into that. There's a lot of struggle that goes into that. So sometimes people hear purpose or calling and they think, oh, that's the easiest option for me, or it can only be my purpose if it's easy for me. It can often be the opposite. You look at the example of David here. So at the time when kings go off to war, so he remains in Jerusalem. So he's sleeping on a nice bed, roof over his head, right, while the rest of the army is sleeping on rocks, as Uriah even says later in the chapter. He's got servants preparing his meals that I'm sure are very nice meals, right, in the comfort of the palace. He's got 2 Samuel 3. He's got 8 different wives right now, right? So it's very nice for him to just stay in Jerusalem like this versus he's out there sleeping on the rocks and hooking and jabbing every day, fighting the Ammonites. But comfort now can cause immense pain later.
Correct. And that's what leads us, that's the context of where David is before this sin. So lean into it. Again, this is verse 1 of 2 Samuel 11. It says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, and David was a warrior, that was his identity, that's what he was known as. David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. This is verse 2. It says, one evening David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, isn't that Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. Then she went back home.
Yeah, so that verse 2 here. So one evening David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. if you understand what's going on in David's life here, there's actually a lot to learn from that verse, because we just mentioned before he had how many wives already?
8.
Right? So, got up from his bed and walked around the roof of the palace. Probably not sleeping alone, right? So, eight different wives there. That's an important point, because I've heard so many young men just say that over the years, where they may have a lust problem that's manifesting in, could be multiple different ways, right? Whether it often through pornography, right? But could be with many other ways that lust just manifests itself in bad ways in people's lives and the problems that it causes, right? And then they'll look at marriage as like, when I get married, then that's going to solve all these problems. Once I get married, then all this is going to go away. And what they don't realize is that that's not going to solve your lust problem. So you getting married, that's not going to just magically then take that away.
For a lot of people, it multiplies it, from what I've heard. And some also don't understand about David. This is a wife of a respected man in his army, right? This is the baddest army on earth that he's head of. Uriah the Hittite was one of the top 37 men in that army. So it's not like it was insignificant, the woman that he was deciding to sleep with. But more importantly, the amount of red flags and stop signs he passed through before committing the sin.
Yeah, it's, we talk about, marriage isn't going to solve that. It's not going to solve your lust problem for you. And that's because that sin just exists kind of in its own world where it never has enough. Lust is never satisfied, right? It promises you everything and gives you nothing. And that's because of the law of accommodation. Response to stimulus decreases over time. So anything where you're dealing with the brain, you need greater and greater levels of stimulus to achieve the same effect. And that's where you really get into sexual sin, as Satan soaks you neurologically and at a very young age into things that may not seem that bad when you're 11, 12, 13, right? But because you need more and more of that, it takes you to a place that you never thought that you would go, and causes, as it talks about in James 1, that death, where it's not talking about physical death, but what it's talking about is taking away the things that God has for you in life, because it's created such a problem in your life where it can take away guys' jobs, their healthy relationships, and just the promises of God in their life, because lust has become such a problem because it always needs more and more and more. Now, this dynamic that he's having here where it says, from the roof he saw a woman bathing, the chemicals that's working there is, that's oxytocin and vasopressin, right? The bonding hormones of sex. That works visually. That's where guys get hooked on pornography, is that they're visually seeing this image, but they're being bonded to that through oxytocin. So now the prefrontal cortex of the brain, your logical part of the brain, is getting overpowered then by the limbic system. So it's like he sees Bathsheba and it's like, boom, now limbic system is running, and prefrontal cortex, logic, reason, and judgment is getting overpowered here. Now, to this point, it's important to note, he hasn't done anything wrong. Okay, so this is Old Testament time. You don't have the fulfillment of the law in the New Testament where it talks about a husband of but how many wives? One, right? So he wasn't doing wrong by having 8 wives. He wouldn't have been doing wrong by taking another wife here, right? Because of what's going on here, and just, okay, here's the provision of Old Testament. He's the king, right? This is how things are done, and this isn't a democracy, so it's somebody who's going to be a successor to him. So kings had a lot of wives, a lot of sons. That's part of just the power dynamic. We're living in the real world here, right? Of the of how it was then in those times with a monarchy in the Old Testament. But he sees this woman bathing, right? Bathsheba. Says he was very beautiful. And that's, what you talked about last week, which is the aspect of access to excess, right? Where you're the king and you just send someone to find out about it, where you're the king and you can just tell her to come. This isn't like you see a beautiful woman and, there it ends, or you see that on Instagram, right? Guys see, here's a, beautiful woman on Instagram, where it's not just like, send people to get her, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so he definitely had access to excess. He's the king. It's important to realize if we were in David's shoes, we probably would have done the same exact thing, right? Big step in humility to recognize that, all right? We can understand why he did what he did. With that being said, there's a man who asked him, isn't that Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Like, do you really want to go through with this? And who is the king gonna?
Right, yeah. As soon as it's wife, that's where it stops.
That's adultery,
right?
As soon as someone's married, that's a big no-go, right? And in modern day, there's many ways to act appropriately, right? When you're married, when someone else is married, he's king, right? Even with this person bringing that up to him, should David have been humble enough and had enough reason back in that moment, right? Because you can understand how he got there to where reason was out the window. He sees the Bible says beautiful woman,
right,
and she's naked, all right? Your instincts start to kick in. With that being said, here's his chance to have that stop sign and come back to reason, come back to earth, come back to this is a respected man's wife, not just, and I'd hate to say that, but that's a real factor, all right? This wasn't some random person's wife. This is a respected man's wife, all right? He has that opportunity, and he blows right past it.
Yeah. And you know how serious God takes that, because you can even see that in Genesis. So Pharaoh takes Abram's wife, Sarai, thinking it's his sister. So he didn't even know, because Abram told him it was his sister. And it says that the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his entire household over that. And that's then how Pharaoh then knew. He's like, what have you done to me with this? And says, get out of here. Then that's repeated later with Abimelech. Takes Sarah in, same thing, where Abram's saying, this is my sister. Doesn't lay a hand on her, right? The Lord says, I've kept you from touching her, but says, you are as good as a dead man if you don't return her, because you have taken a married woman. He says, what have I done? I did this with clean hands and a clean conscience. But it still says that the Lord had closed the wombs of everybody in Abimelech's household because of just taking Sarah in, hadn't even slept with her, right? And didn't even know that she was married. And there still was a consequence there. So that's how serious the Lord's taken that.
Correct.
So that should have been the stop sign, like you said, is as soon as he hears wife of Uriah the Hittite, now you have the dynamic of this lust that's going on, right? Limbic part of the brain is firing. Okay, so in terms of neurochemistry, literally has, the salience network, literally energy is being released from the motor cortex for him to now complete this task of sleeping with her, which he can do, right? Because he's the king and he can just say, you come, right? So that's telling him one thing. And then over here should be the fear of the Lord, where, this is the wife of Uriah the Hittite, and that's where it should stop.
Yeah, and one more point that I want to make on that. The Bible says that we're led to sin by our own desires, right? But the Lord promises he will always provide a way out.
Yes.
So be mindful of that. Even if you're King David, even if you have access to excess, even if you have the fame and notoriety to where you can just snap your fingers and there they are, he was still provided a way out, right? He wasn't where he was supposed to be. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. He wasn't walking in his purpose. King was supposed to be out to war. David's a warrior. Even with that, he hadn't committed the sin up to that point. He sees her. The temptation is set. He still provided a way out.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Very good point there, that and that's from what Tyler's referencing there. That's from 1 Corinthians 10, right? That when you are under temptation. So first it tells you, no temptation has seized you except what is common to man. So God's not going to give you anything beyond what you can bear. No temptation has seized you except what's common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. That's such a good verse, because if you're like, oh my gosh, this all this temptation is coming at me. And temptation itself is not a sin, right? Because we know, as it says in Hebrews, that Jesus, when he was on earth, was tempted in every way, yet was without sin. Mm-hmm. Right? So the temptation itself is not the sin. Just because you have this desire, right, doesn't mean you sinned. It's now that aspect of you didn't heed the stop signs and you carried through, right? God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. Right? So very good verse there from Corinthians in dealing with that, because we're in a modern generation where sometimes it's tough to avoid, because it's everywhere now. Simple example, literally opened a football app, the score today. Early in the evening, check the Monday night score. Flashes me with this ad that was just like, what? It was like basically like PG-13, right? But it's just like that 100% can be a trigger. The best way to look at that is it's not the first glance that gets you, it's the second one. Mm-hmm. It's the second one, right? So it's like that's where really you're getting trapped visually, because that's look you're wired that way for a reason, right? That's how the species ultimately propagates itself, right? For men, right? This is like, okay, you see this woman that's attracted to you, right? But the calling that you're given as a believer is that Jesus says, if you even look lustfully at a woman, right, you've committed adultery with her in your heart, right? Yeah. So it's a really high standard, but the Lord's telling you it does start with your eyes, because that's literally how neurochemistry works. You will bond to images and get stuck in images because of how oxytocin works, right? And then if you are acting upon that, that's your highest chemical release in the body, the highest chemical reward, 4 times the amount of morphine. So now you're starting to build this pattern in the brain. This is how guys get hooked on pornography, and it gets worse and worse and worse, and gets so tough to unwind because they built that pattern in the brain where you bonded to these images, and then now you've experienced this transient euphoric feeling with it, and it's very tough to break. So what you're seeing here literally in 2 Samuel 11 is you're seeing David looking at this woman, and that's getting him stuck. And now he's at the point of, is he going to now disobey the Lord on it? Or is he going to operate with the fear of the Lord on it, right? Yeah. And have to deny himself, because that's what it is, right? Because that limbic system is firing and telling him, oh, I want this. Can I deny myself and instead do what the Lord calls me to do? Very tough, right? Painful.
It's tough and painful to begin with. Think about how much tougher and more painful it is to deny yourself when you have all the comforts that he had, right? It might be a little bit easier to deny yourself when you're the shepherd boy.
No.
When you're going after the Philistines and you're killing Goliath and you're on the come up, right? It might be a little easier to fear the Lord then, right? When you are king and you are established and you have already conquered so much and you don't even have to be at war and you're still conquering, right? How much harder is it to deny yourself then, right? And I think that's what we're seeing here. And so what's the takeaway? A lot of these problems started because he wasn't walking in his purpose. Mm-hmm. He let his hands be idle.
Yeah.
Right? So the Lord knew what he was doing when he created our minds the way he created them, to where we're visual, We have that desire to procreate. He knows how to set the species to keep on going. He created us fearfully and wonderfully, right? So that desire is in David for a reason. He also gave us the desire to build, right? And so David has this opportunity, one, to go to war, to accomplish things, to take action and walk in purpose, which if you actually do that, there's great satisfaction in that, right? So instead of letting his hands be idle, instead of not walking in his purpose, instead of giving himself the opportunity to see her naked and giving himself the opportunity to bring her to him, he could have been at war, killing people, having success, experiencing great pleasure in different ways, and doing what he's supposed to be doing, walking in the Lord's will and purpose, right?
Yeah,
there's a substitute for that.
Right. Yeah, the idle hands, that's where it goes, right? It's boredom, desire, vice.
Correct.
That's how it goes. And that's a great point where it started with he's not doing what he was called to do. He's putting himself in the position of idle hands.
He woke up looking around.
Right.
How did the king have time to do that?
Yeah, that's an important point because you got a culture now, everybody talks about how they're busy. I'm so busy. And everybody on average is spending 7 to 8 hours a day on their phone.
Correct.
If you're iPhone generation, meaning you grew up with the phone, 7 to 8 hours a day. So nobody's busy. There's a lot of idle time going on. And a lot of that is getting funneled through the phone, where the phone is in and of itself. It's like you're carrying around this temptation. Some of the stuff that you see on the phone, that whether you're finding it yourself or you're coming across it even accidentally, tough to find in real life.
Yeah.
Had to go out of your way to find the anger and just the division and the hatred and the lust and the amount of just, junk that's on the phone that's just a click away now on the phone. Mm-hmm. And if you got that dynamic of boredom going on, well, then, desire, vice, starting with the idle hands. So, great point about it. Started with he just wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. He was setting himself up for failure. Woe to the man that has purpose and a calling and is not following through on it. That you're gonna be miserable no matter what. Like Tyler's saying, he could have been out experiencing and walking in his purpose, which, yes, would have been much harder, but much, much more rewarding. Instead, he chose the comfort now, causing so much pain later.
Which he walked incorrectly in the come up, right?
Yeah.
He denied himself in the come up. He took the hard path, the uncomfortable path, fearing the Lord in the come up, right? And that's why you saw so much success. And you saw the Lord's will just laid out step after step after step, despite what came against him. It was not an easy road to get to 2 Samuel 11, right? You had Saul after him in many ways. You had actual warfare that, it's cool to look back on it and look at the victory, but...
Civil war with Saul? Yeah. With Saul's house, yeah.
All sorts of things, right? All sorts of challenges, right? Which he went through. Takeaway here is, Lord, despite the discomfort, which in America is a real thing, people are so afraid of being uncomfortable. We expect all the comfortness, all the cushiness, all the luxury, right? We expect that as a given without earning it, right? There's generations before that just gave us that opportunity and ability, right? Can you be faithful? Because the Lord wants the best version of you. Are you willing to accept what he's going to put in front of you, the opportunity he's going to put in front of you that are disguised as challenges, right? And are you going to walk in your purpose? Are you going to seek your calling? Are you going to seek counsel of what am I good at? What does the Lord put in me? What are the next steps? What is wisdom, right? Can you accept that? Because if you do, all of a sudden there's purpose and calling that you get to walk in and be blessed in, and not all the pain and consequences that David went through by not doing what he was supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And unfortunately, to wrap this week, as you see there in verse 4, he did give in to the temptation. He sends for messengers to get her. She came to him and he slept with her. Right? Then she went back home. Verse 5, the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant.
Uh-oh.
Yep, and that's what we'll get into next week, is continuing on in Psalm 51, talking about David's sin and everything that came with it. Monday Night Pod, Tyler and Fensky.